Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we'll start today the medium access control. So we'll get out of the basement and we'll start talking in the first floor, the data link layer, right? So we'll be covering these topics in this part. So again, we'll be talking about space division multiple access, FDMA, TDMA. Same thing, we talked about them from the physical layer point of view, where a node can actually change the frequency or change the time slot, and we have to have synchronization and so on. Here, we're going to use it to control the access to the channel. So here, we're talking about a wireless channel, and we need to control who will have access to the channel. So SDMA, FDMA, TDMA, these are collision-free medium access control techniques, and then we'll talk about Aloha, which is one of the techniques that supports collision, and we'll talk about collision avoidance, and then we'll talk about pulling, CDMA, and we'll talk about some other techniques that combines aspects from FDMA and TDMA together with carrier sense multiple access. So it's like a combination between the two. So basically, at the beginning, well, since we are now moving from wired to wireless, can we actually try all the techniques that we have done for wired? And the answer is basically no. There are some fundamental differences in wireless that requires us to think differently. So, for example, carrier sense multiple access with collision detection. Well, first of all, collision detection cannot be done perfectly in wireless. In wired, it's easy because when the signal goes into the wire, there is no decay in terms of power. So the signal does not lose its power. Okay? For a long time, for a long distance, the signal actually does not lose its power. So for any node to detect the collision is easy. Why? Because if the power level on the line is P, this means that there is only one node sending. If the power line is almost 2P, this means that there are two people sending, in which case we can detect that there is a collision, right? So that's how we detect the collision. So
collision
if it's
means what
collision is like two people are sending at the same time, in which case I cannot really extract one signal from the other because they are superimposed on each other. Okay. Well, of course there are some techniques now that you can, but for us they are not. If you have two signals sent at the same time on the same frequency, then they are not distinguishable from each other, right? So on wire this is easy because if the power level on the line is below certain noise threshold, so we think that, or we assume that there's no one is sending and the line is idle. Okay. And then, as we have explained before, carrier sense multiple access is like you sense, there's no one on the line, then you start sending. When you start sending, you may have collision. Why? Because two people have taken the decision to send at the same time, so they will collide. Any node can detect that there is a collision. How? It measures the power level on the line, and the power level is close to 2P. So we know that the transmission power, if it's double that or close to double, then we assume that there are two people are sending. If it's triple, we know that three people are sending, and so on. So it's easy to detect it on the wire line. On wireless, it's different because, as we said before, the power decays proportionally with the square of the distance, right? As we have explained before. So the power level decays drastically in the case of wireless. So maybe you have a power level of P and there are two people sending. We don't know, right? So detecting the collision is really tricky in wireless, and that's why they usually in wireless they change this collision detection thing with what they call a collision. So instead of collision detection in wireless we have collision avoidance. We cannot detect the collision, but we can try to avoid it. And we'll see how we can do this in wireless. So that's one fundamental thing in wireless. We cannot detect the collision perfectly. So instead, we can try to avoid it as much as possible, but we cannot eliminate it altogether. So as we said, this is because the signal strength decreases proportionally to the square of the distance. Okay? So as the signal travels, through the distance, it actually decays in terms of power. So the summation of power of two people are sending, the summation of the power can take any value. So it's very tricky for us to detect that there is a collision. We cannot. The sender would apply carrier sense and collision detection, but collisions happen at the receiver, right? So the collision itself happens at the receiver. There's no collision happen at the sender, by the way. The sender is sending. Okay, so when I send a signal, the collision happens at the receiver, not at the transmitter. So it might be the case that the sender cannot hear the collision, right? So we'll see how this happens. So we have some scenarios that we will explain that will, show you one of the common, situations where the sender can send without really, the sender will sense the channel, and the channel seems to be idle, although it's not. So this is a very tricky situation. So the sender will send, and the collision happens at the receiver, but the sender doesn't know. Okay, because it cannot hear anything that's going to the receiver. It doesn't know that the receiver is actually receiving another signal. So
there is no way to get acknowledged.
There is no way to, well, in that case, the only way for us to realize that there was a collision is by not receiving the acknowledgement that the receiver will encounter the collision. Therefore, it will not be able to distinguish one signal from the other. So it gives up. It says, okay, I did not receive anything, therefore I will not send back an acknowledgement. So we have to wait all the time out before we realize that there was a collision and we can retransmit or do something about it. Okay. So the carrier sensing might not work if we have a hidden terminal. So how does this look like? So one of the very common scenarios is what we call hidden terminal problem. This is a very common scenario in wireless, particularly in ad hoc networks where there's no access point. Or actually it happens if you have an access point, and the collision happens at the access point. Okay? So how does this work? Well, imagine if we have 3 nodes like this. A is trying to send to B, and C is also trying to send to B. This is a very simple scenario. Okay? When C sends to B, A is not in the transmission range of C, right? So does A know or listen to the transmission going from C to B? No.
So it will send to B as
because A is not in the transmission range. The transmission range is this yellow circle here. And this yellow circle does not reach A. So A cannot really recognize that C is sending to B, which means that C is a hidden terminal for A. That's what this is called. So C is hidden from A. Okay? But C is also sending to B. A is trying to send to B. Well, A will do carrier sensing. Well, nobody seems to be sending anything, right? So it tries to send to B, right? Because the problem here is that carrier sensing has to happen at the sender, but the collision happens at the receiver, right? So
sender means whereas CS actually carrier sense has to be done by sender.
but
or
by the
receiver.
sender before it sends, right? So well, you have to go back to and refresh your memory with because we have actually explained this as part of the introduction to computer networks, that there is carrier sense multiple access with collision detection. So what happens is that before a node sends, okay, it's like imagine that we are in a meeting. The way the carrier sense works is that, well, anyone is allowed to speak at any point in time, but before they speak, they have to make sure that nobody else is speaking.
Okay, fine.
That's it. So this is how we control the access to the line or the access to the channel. Okay. So first we see, is anybody talking? No, so I can talk. Is anybody sending at this point in time? No, so I can send. Okay. So that's what happens. But the problem here is that C is hidden from A, so A does not know that C is sending anything, in which case it will try to send to B and the collision happens. Right? So that's what we call a hidden terminal problem. Another scenario which does not cause a collision, but it actually causes non-transmission prematurely because of the exposed terminal problem. What happens here is that if we have...
Doctor, can I just ask a question
Sure,
before?
go ahead.
Regarding the intersection between A and C, there is a small area where...
Here?
Yes. So we don't consider this as like having C in the domain of A?
No.
So
No.
it should be...
Because each circle is independent. The problem is that A, before it sends, it does carrier sensing.
So the carrier
So
sensing
it
will
has to be
involve
through the circle of C. I did not try to send. The carrier sensing is not detected, or the carrier is not detected by sending a signal, and then if it overlaps with your signal, then I know that you are
No,
sending.
before
It doesn't
sending.
doesn't.
It's before sending we do this.
Before sending, what happens is that A will have to be in the transmission range of C in order to hear C. Like we are in a meeting, okay, and you are sitting here and somebody else is sitting at the other side of the room, okay? So maybe when he speaks, you will not hear that he is speaking, okay? So you will start talking as if there is nobody else is speaking, although there is one speaking. If there is a person sitting in the middle, he will be able to hear you and hear him. That's what we mean by the hidden terminal problem. Okay, so if there is somebody in the middle, he is hearing that person and he's hearing you, but you're not hearing him. Okay, so the collision happens at the person in the middle, because he cannot really interpret both at the same time. He has to listen to one at a time.
So it's about the percentage of intersection. This was...
No, if there is no, if no, it's
I
not.
understand this concept, but the problem that there is intersection with C.
There has to be an intersection with C at B, otherwise B will not be able to listen to them. Okay.
Okay.
But what happens is that I will not generate this circle at the beginning. I will have to wait to see if C is transmitting anything. In order for me to hear that C is transmitting anything, this circle has to contain A.
Oh, the whole...
Yes, this yellow circle
So
has to
if
contain
B is
A.
sending- if-
In which case, in this case, it doesn't. That's the only way for me to hear that C is sending. Otherwise, C for me is hidden.
But B for A is
But
not
B,
hidden.
yes, exactly.
So okay, خلاص, I got that.
B is for A is not hidden, and C for B is not hidden. Okay, so the only thing is that C is hidden from A. The exposed terminal problem, okay, happens if you have like 3 nodes like this, but instead of A sending to B, in that case B is sending to A. Okay, and C is trying to send to another node, D. Okay, so let's see how this works. Well, for this situation, so imagine if I have A here, and you have B, and you have C, and you have another D terminal. B is trying to send to A, and B in fact is in the transmission range of A, so that's normal, right? So if B can reach to A, the transmission range includes C as well, right? Which means that when B tries to send to A, C can hear, right? Okay, so now C is trying to send to D, okay? Should this transmission happen or not? Logically.
It should happen.
It should happen, right? Because the collision usually happens at the receiver. But here, the two receivers are far apart, so there is no problem, okay? But what will actually happen using carrier sensing? Will C actually transmit to D?
That's only
C, well,
the domain is
right, so C now, before it sends, it has to do carrier sensing, right?
It will find that B is sending.
It will find that B is sending.
But it doesn't know B is sending to who.
Yeah, it doesn't know.
So
Because carrier sensing is physical layer, it's not data link, so I cannot really recognize that B is sending to A and I'm sending to D, and what is the location of A and what is the location of D? We don't do this.
So
It's the physical layer thing. So C will abstain from transmission, although logically it should. So this is a transmission opportunity that I missed because of carrier sensing. I should have actually transmitted, but I didn't. So this is the exposed terminal problem. Okay, so these are problems with the concept of carrier sensing that causes carrier sensing to be a non-perfect technique. Okay, so we need, especially in wireless, because there's no hidden terminal problem for wired. It doesn't happen. Okay, in wired there's no collision. Well, there is, but I mean, it's totally different. It works differently. Okay, so there is also the concept of near far, and this scenario is not that common, but terminals A and B and C receives signals, so signal strength decreases proportionally to the square root of the distance. So therefore, the signal of terminal B, okay, drowns out A's transmission. So what happens here is that if A wants to send to B, okay, in that case, if B wants to send to C, in that case there should be no collision. But the problem here is that because the two transmissions are happening at the same time, A has a significant amount of transmission power, so it reaches to C. So A is far from C, okay, but B is close to C. But when B tries to send, it gets drowned, which means that it gets a significant amount of interference from A. So although A is far and B is close to C, but the power of A will interfere with the power of B because A is using a significant amount of power. So so this is what we call the near and far terminal. Okay, so it would be good if A uses less transmission power. If A uses less transmission power, okay, the transmission power will not reach C, and it will reach B only, right? In which case, when B tries to send, C will listen to B, and B will listen to A. Okay? But the problem here is that A used a significant amount of transmission power, so it actually performs some kind of interference, or we call it that it drowns the signals of B. Okay? So it affects the signal of B in a negative way.
But here it is written B drowns out A signal.
Right, it happens on both directions. So if we assume that C is sending to A and B is sending to A, it's the same thing. So it's yeah, so one of them drowns the signal of the other. So this is because of the fact that there is one close and one far. But the one far uses a significant amount of power, and although we know that power decays, but it's still in the same transmission range of both nodes. So it sends to one, but it affects the signal from the other one. So it drowns the signal. Both they drown the signal of each other. Okay, so they cause interference with each other.
If we minimize the power coming from
exactly. So if we do some power control, we should be able to avoid this situation. But
A will not be able to send to C in any way.
Right. Yes. So unless if you use power control and you increase the power whenever you want to send to C and reduce the power if you want to send to D, which means that you adjust the transmission power based on the distance. But this requires that you have to know the location of that person, right? Which complicates things, because if you need to maintain the location at the data link layer, this requires overhead. Okay. As we said before, this particular problem also causes some problems, particularly with CDMA networks. If you remember, as we said before, the way that CDMA works is that it should, because CDMA talks about the fact that you send two signals at the same time, but they are using different codes, right? So the condition now that you are able to extract one signal from the other is to apply the particular code at the composite signal, so you extract the signal that used this code, right? So the condition in that case is the fact that the signal power for both has to reach C at the same level. This is the condition. Okay? So both signals have to reach to the receiver at the same power level in order for the receiver to use the right code and extract one signal from the other. Okay? Which means that the two signals have to be close, very close to each other. Okay? In that case, in this particular case, there is what we call the near-far effect. The near-far effect. One node is far and one node is very close. So unless we use power control at A in order to send to C, C will not be able to distinguish one signal from the other. Okay, so this is the concept of near-far effect, which is particularly tricky for CDMA networks. So that's why for CDMA networks you have to use power control. You must adapt power based on how far you are from the receiver. You have to. Okay. All right. So for these reasons, wireless is different because of all these scenarios that we just talked about. There is the hidden terminal problem, exposed terminal problem, the near-far effect. All these happen in wireless, not in wired. So we have to think differently when we talk about medium access control for wireless networks, right? So some techniques are now, collision-free, and we said that the only way for us to have a collision-free environment is that we have to divide. Okay, so so as we said, we have three ways or actually 4 if we consider CDMA as well, that we can divide the channel between multiple nodes. We can divide it in the space, so we have space division multiplexing. What is the way to do this? Is by using directional antenna. Okay, so all these hidden terminal problems, exposed terminal problems, all these scenarios, or most of them, can be avoided if we can have directional antenna. So we will not have a circle for transmission range in that case. We will have like a cone. Okay, in which case we can direct this cone based on the direction of the receiver. So I would not affect any other nodes. Okay, so if I can do this, I can avoid all these problems. So space division multiple access is a way to do this, and this uses the sectorized antenna or the sectorized cell structure that we talked about last time. Okay, or FDME, or frequency division multiplexing, or multiple access. When we add the A at the end, this means that we use frequency division to control the access to the channel between multiple nodes. Okay. So we can assign a certain frequency for each node to send, but the issue here is that both the transmitter and the receiver, they need to be adjusted to the same frequency in order to hear each other. So for the hidden terminal problem, if A can send to B, okay, using a particular frequency, and C can send to B using another frequency, then B has to have two transceivers working at two different frequencies, right, to be able to listen to both of them. If that's the case, then there's no collision. Okay. But in that case, B is required to have two transceivers working at two different frequencies. Okay, so that's the condition. Okay, so in that case, if we allocate the frequency, we can allocate the frequency on a slow fashion or a very fast fashion, which means that we can use slow hopping. Hopping here means changing from one frequency to another. So we can assign frequency ranges to the nodes and make them fixed. Okay? In which case, we change the frequency of the receiving nodes based on where they want to listen, who they want to listen to. But the transmitters, they use one single frequency, and they don't actually switch to any other frequency, at least for a long period of time. Okay, this is the case for GSM, by the way. For second generation, this is the case. So GSM defines 124 different channels. Okay, so if a user gets into a cell, a user gets assigned a particular channel, which means that we can support up to 124 users using this frequency. However, as we will see later, we can definitely support more than 124 users, right? By dividing each channel using TDMA. So we actually use FDMA, TDMA. So we divide the spectrum into 124 channels, and then we divide each channel to different time slots. In which case we can support the number of time slots times the number of frequency channels. Okay, so we'll talk. Okay, so this is what we call slow hopping. So we assign these frequencies for a duration of time, for a long period of time, and we don't change it until the node gets deassociated or gets out of the range of this cell, and it gets to another range to another cell. Then it may actually get another channel. Okay, so it changes slowly. It doesn't change very often. It changes very slowly. There is also what we call fast hopping, which happens sometimes in Bluetooth. In Bluetooth, uses fast hopping. There is a technology called frequency hopping spread spectrum. Frequency hopping spread spectrum. So this happens in Bluetooth, where if actually two nodes are sending, they actually change the frequency, okay, very often. They agree on using different frequency very often. Why do they do this? The reason is because even if there is any interference from another node, okay, this interference will disappear if we change the frequency. So we keep hopping very fast. And why do we do this in Bluetooth? Because of the fact that Bluetooth is very short range. So it supports some kind of dense networks. So if you are in a conference and you are trying to talk to a person using Bluetooth, chances are you will have interference from other different sources, right? So you will have interference from other different sources. Okay? So in that case, you keep hopping the frequency in order to kind of maneuver. You try to maneuver, like by changing from one frequency to another, so that you jump from the interference of this to the interference of this to the interference of this. So this way you try to kind of avoid the interference around you. Okay? And you do that, usually you do this very fast. And that's why they call it frequency hopping spread spectrum. Okay? So in Bluetooth it works as clusters. So you have one communication between you, and so one of you has to be a head and the other is like one of you has to be a master and the other one is slave, right? So master and slave. So and then you keep the communication, but there is another communication going on. So there is a master and slave. So this communication interferes with you. So the way to avoid this interference is by using this frequency hopping. You keep changing the frequency very fast in order to try to find a channel for a short duration of time which has no interference. But then you don't know whether this channel has an interference strong or maybe weak. So you have to keep randomizing the frequency that you use for a short period of time. So you use different frequency at different points in time.
So the sender and receiver, how come they know that the sender is
frequency range to be used?
Yeah, so they have to agree. So part of the protocol that they have to agree on what is the next hop, what is the next when and how they hop to another frequency. They have to agree as part of the protocol. Okay. Of course, there is TDMA, and TDMA we assign different time slots. Okay. You assign different time slots to different nodes, and as we have talked about before, one problem in TDMA is synchronization. So synchronizing these time slots between multiple nodes which are distributed. Okay, as long as there is no centralized clock, synchronization is always a problem. Okay. So one last thing is that remember that these techniques can be combined with each other. So I can use FDMA TDMA, or SDMA TDMA, or SDMA FDMA. I can combine. Okay, I can combine some of these techniques together. I can generate like a hybrid technique by combining any of these two techniques, or maybe the three of them. So I have a sectorized antenna, and as well I use different frequency for each node, and also within this frequency I use time slots. So generally speaking, I can use the three of them combined, and that's actually what happens in GSM. So GSM, it uses, SDMA is an option for GSM. It's an option, okay? But it uses FDMA, TDMA, for sure, okay? So it divides the channel into 124, it divides the spectrum into 124 channels, and then it divides each channel using slots type. This is how it looks like. So so GSM uses what we call frequency division duplex. So what does this mean? Frequency division duplex
You can send and receive.
talks about duplex, the duplex mode, whether we can send and receive at the same time. So this bidirectional transmission also requires some kind of channel control, right? So in order for you to be able to send and receive at the same time, as well, either you send on a time slot and receive on a time slot, or you send on a frequency and you receive on a different frequency, right? So the only way to have both directions going is by either using different frequency or different time, right? So this is what we call frequency division duplex, where we use different frequencies. So this is what we call the downlink. The downlink is from the base station to the mobile node, and another set of frequency for the uplink. So this is the downlink and this is the uplink. Okay, so we use this range of frequency for the downlink and this range of frequency for the uplink. Okay, so in that case, GSM defines in the downlink defines 124 channels.
The downlink from the
Is always from the base station to the mobile. Always from the base station, from the central node to the mobile node, we always call it downlink. Okay, and from the node to the base station or to the centralized node or to the access point, we always call it a uplink. Okay. So you have 124 channels downlink and 124 channels uplink. And you start from, and this is of course the 900 megahertz GSM. So this is GSM in the 900 megahertz range. So so you start from 890.2 all the way to 915. So this is about 43 or 50, 30, 25, 35, 25. So 25 megahertz. 25 megahertz, each channel will be 0.2 megahertz. Okay, the channel bandwidth is actually 0.2 megahertz. Each of these channels will be further divided into, as we said, into time slots later. So it's not that we can only support 128 nodes and that's it, 124 nodes and that's it. So we can support more than this by dividing each channel into TDM, using TDMA. So if I want to know the frequency of a particular channel, then it's easy. So for example, for the uplink, it's 890.2 or 890 actually plus N is the channel number times 0.2. That's it. So channel 1 will be 890.2. Channel 2 will be 890.4, and so on. So it's very easy. So channel 124 will be actually 914.8, right? And it will end at 915. Okay. Same thing for the downlink. Okay.
There is a 20 megahertz difference there, no?
Right. Yeah. There is. So there is a gap, of course, between the uplink and downlink, so that you don't have interference between, because you are trying to transmit and receive at the same time. So you have a gap between the uplink. So if it's part of FDD, frequency division duplex, that you need to have again a guard band between the transmission range and the receiving range. Okay. Also, there is TDD, TDMA. So TDD here refers to, again, uplink and downlink. But here, in that case, TDD is time division duplex. So in that case, you send at one time slot and you receive on another time slot, not on another frequency. Okay? So you divide your channel. So the good thing here is that we can take the whole bandwidth of the entire spectrum as one channel. So here, maybe the spectrum is like 20 megahertz. Okay? And then we divide the 20 megahertz in the time so that you have specific time slots for uplink and specific time slots for downlink. Okay?
This 417 microsecond.
This is the time slot, the one time slot. This is used for DICT. Remember, this is for the digital phones or the
Wireless, cordless
for
phones.
for cordless phones, right? Okay, so this type of standard, it uses TDD, TDMA. In fact, Bluetooth uses a similar technique, but it uses actually it's a little bit tricky because it uses one time slot for downlink and one time slot for uplink, and then one time slot for downlink, one time slot for uplink. So for downlink, it's always from the master node to any of the slave nodes. So there's one time slot from the master node to any of the slaves. And there is another time slot which gets assigned to any of the nodes to send to the master node. And it always comes like uplink, downlink, uplink, downlink. Okay? And remember, we're using frequency hopping spread spectrum by changing the frequency for each time slot. So from one slot to another, we can hop to another frequency. And the reason for this is to avoid the interference. Okay?
So it's like using both.
It's like using both, but there is a slight difference because for GSM it uses FDMA to facilitate the concurrent transmission. So it assigns the frequency to the different nodes to have concurrent transmission. Bluetooth changes the frequency or hops from one frequency to another to avoid the interference. Only to avoid the interference. But it does not use it to facilitate concurrent transmission. No, it doesn't do that.
The master and slave in.
Because the master node is allowed to send is allowed to receive from one node at a time. Anyway.
Right. When we
Right.
use Bluetooth, we just
Right. But it hops from one frequency to another only to avoid interference. That's it. To avoid interference from other cells or from other, Bluetooth transmission.
The access point is the master.
The access point, yes, the access point for the case of Wi-Fi. We didn't talk about Wi-Fi here. Okay, we're talking about Bluetooth because Bluetooth uses TDD, TDMA. It does use TDD, TDMA, but with a slight difference from here. There is a slight difference. Okay, but it uses a similar concept, and it uses frequency hopping to change from one frequency to another to avoid interference, but not to facilitate concurrent transmission.
Okay, but master concept, how did it come? If I'm transmitting from this phone to another phone
Right.
through Bluetooth, so which
You
becomes the
have
master?
to designate one of them as a master node. You have to.
Okay.
You have to. Okay, so the master node, it has to be allocated one time slot to send to one of the slaves because Bluetooth supports multiple slaves connecting to the same master node. Okay, so it's similar to Wi-Fi. Whenever any two slaves can communicate, they have to communicate through the master node.
Okay.
That's how it works.
at the same time.
They have to do it through the master node. So if a node wants to send to another node, both of them have one master. So this has to send to the master, and then the master has to send. So it uses the uplink time slot to send to the master, and then in the downlink, it sends from the master to the other node. It has to be done through 2 time slots. It consumes 2 time slots. It has to be done this way. Okay. Same to Wi-Fi, although Wi-Fi does not use TDMA. Remember, Wi-Fi uses a carrier sense multiple access with collision avoidance.
How to avoid that.
It uses a totally different technique for medium access control. I'll bring this as a question. Okay, so here we're talking about medium access control techniques for different standards. Okay, so we talked about GSM uses a TDMA, FDMA, right? And it uses FDD for transmission and reception, right? We talked about DECT, it uses TDD, TDMA, right? We didn't talk about any, frequency hopping here. DECT does not use frequency hopping. And we talked about Bluetooth, which uses, again, TDD, TDMA, okay, with frequency hopping in order to avoid interference. Okay. All right, so switching back to collision-based techniques, okay? One of the very common concepts, although it's not used in any standards, but it's one of the most common concepts in medium access control. It's actually the first one that was invented. The guy called Aloha in Hawaii, he actually, until now, they are really proud of this guy who actually invented. When you go to Hawaii, you always Aloha. They say Aloha is like Assalamu alaikum. Yeah. So this guy actually, it's very simple technique. It's like we are in a meeting. Whenever anyone wants to speak. No carrier sensing. Nothing. It's like the ultimate freedom. If you want to speak, just speak. So this technique is very simple. Okay, it has no overhead. You don't have to listen before you speak. Okay. So as you can imagine, will this be efficient? It turns out it's very efficient in low load. Because in very low loads, in very low network loads, okay, it allows a person or one node to consume the entire bandwidth of the channel. But that's if there is very low probability that someone else is actually sending. And that's why, remember, like 10 years back in Doha, they were very, very proud, and they were very happy that they have all around Doha there is like roundabouts. They don't actually stop at the roundabout. They don't do carrier sensing. They don't actually stop at the roundabout and check if somebody is. They don't do this. So they can just go very fast. Okay.
Because very little.
And if there is any collision, they will deal with it. But the probability of collision here is very low, right? At low loads. So Aloha is very efficient in low loads. If the network load is low, it's very efficient. Once it becomes a little bit high, then it reaches a certain capacity, and then the probability of collision becomes really, really high, and you saturate at a certain capacity that whenever you increase the rate, the throughput is the same. So it's like this. So this is the rate of transmission, the aggregate rate of transmission from multiple nodes. Okay? And this is the actual throughput, that which of these nodes will be successful in transmission. So at very low load, you find that it's linear, which means that everything goes through. After some time, you will start finding a little bit of saturation.
Then it should go down.
Then it goes down. So at this point in time, you will start encountering some collision, okay, and the capacity of the channel starts to flatten out, and then it decays. Because if you try to increase even more, then the collision probability will go higher and higher and higher, which means that the throughput will go lower and lower. Okay, so basically, so that's how it works. It's very simple. So if A wants to send, just send. If B wants to send, just send. There's no restrictions. But the problem here is that we have to be aware that if you don't have any restrictions and the load starts to increase a little bit, then you'll start to have collision. Like for example, even here you have collision because there is a slight overlap between A and B. So if there's any small overlap, then we consider that there is a collision. So here there is a little bit of overlap. So we consider that there is a collision. Unless this starts and this ends and this starts like this, then there is no collision. But here, obviously, this one overlaps with this, okay, and also overlaps with this. So it has a collision from both sides. Okay, so that's Aloha. There is.
Does that mean that we will lose the whole?
Yeah, all of them, the three of them. All of them. So if there is any collision, all the nodes engaged in that collision, their transmission is gone. Which means that in that case, 3 nodes will have their transmission unsuccessful. Their transmission will fail. Okay? This is what we call asynchronous Aloha. Asynchronous Aloha is that whenever you want to send, just send. You're not even restricted when to send. Okay? There is another version of Aloha called slotted Aloha. Slotted Aloha, if you want to send at this point, if you have a packet to send, you have to wait until the beginning of another time slot. And then you send. When you send, you consume the entire time slot. Okay? And then if you have another packet, then you can send it here in another time slot. Or if there is another node wants to send, it sends at the beginning of the time slot. Okay?
So there is sensing here.
No, there's no sensing.
Oh,
No, there's no sensing. Remember, no sensing.
it will just about the time slot is divided, and each one will start sending by, like, if it's the second sender, then it starts from the second time slot.
Yes, but without any sensing. I'm not sensing here.
Okay.
It's like I'm just saying we are in a meeting. You are allowed to speak, but there are some specific time slots when we allow someone to speak. That's it. But you don't check. You don't do carrier sensing. You don't check if somebody else is speaking.
This is my time
Nothing.
slot. I'll use it, and that's it.
It might actually collide with another person. There's, khalas, okay, that's fine. If collision happens, it happens. Okay. Okay. So. So, for example, if we assume that the time slot is here, okay. So in that case, this yellow guy will not send. So B in that case will not send because it did not capture the beginning of the time slot. So this yellow one will have to wait for another time slot. So that's the only difference.
In this case, C is the one who sends.
Right. So in that case, there will be no collision in this time slot. But C, when it tries to send in the next time slot, knowing that this guy will also detect or will also capture this time slot, so the collision will happen in the next one. But the collision will not happen here. So this is the difference between slotted Aloha and non-slotted Aloha, or asynchronous Aloha. In fact, this slots reduces the probability of collision a little bit just by having these slots. And that's why they try to use slotted Aloha, because in fact we will find that the capacity of the channel will double just by using the concept of slots. Okay? So just by using the concept of slots, we can double the capacity of the channel. And we'll see the, I'm not sure if we'll do it now. We'll see how we can analyze this.
Actually, the time slot is not allotted like first time slot for A, second for B, third for B, C. It's
No.
not like that.
There's no
Anyone,
particular sequence.
Whoever has
Yes.
the
Yes.
startup.
It's free word. Anyone can gain or capture any time slot at any point, but it's just they have to be
Start
asynchronous. Of course, again, the same synchronization problem is a drawback here. It's one of the problems, right? Whenever we have multiple nodes distributed and we want to synchronize a specific time slots, we always have this synchronization issue, right?
By synchronize, you mean that?
Where is the beginning of the time slot? Because remember here, the beginning of the time slot is very important.
So we can have at a point of time where two nodes sending at the beginning of
That's if we don't have a solution for the synchronization problem, but there is. يعني احنا what we say is that it's tricky, it requires some overhead, but it's solved. So it's taken care of, but it's a drawback because it requires the use of centralized time slot. Although the good thing about Aloha is that it's distributed and we don't have to have any coordination between us. Even carrier sensing is not needed.
So
right?
making it
So it's very simple.
Making it synchronized should be very hard. Because it's
No, it's
distributed.
not very hard, but it's an overhead. Making it synchronized, making it slotted, it requires some synchronization for these time slots. And that requires some special technique to synchronize. But it's there, the technique is there. We have multiple solutions for this, either by using centralized clock or by using some time stamping or some, يعني there are some solutions, okay? So the assumptions here is that, of course, for the slotted Aloha, the assumptions here is that all frames, they have the same size because I need to fix the time slot. I need to fix a specific time slot with a specific duration, so I better have all the frames with the same size. Time is divided into equal size slots. Nodes start transmission only at the beginning of the time slot. So if it has a packet available, it has to wait for the beginning of the next time slot. If it doesn't have any packet available, then it's fine. It doesn't have to wait for anything. Okay? And nodes are synchronized, and we said that this is a tricky thing. And if two or more nodes transmit, the collision will happen. Okay? But in the slotted Aloha, we will find out that the probability of collision is reduced actually almost to the half. So when node obtains a fresh frame, it transmits to the next time slot. So it has to wait for this. If no collision, node can send a new frame in the next time slot. If collision happens, then it sends the same frame in the next time slot. Okay? And a node sends a frame in a time slot with a probability of P. Because P is now the parameter that we will use in the analysis. So we assume that any node can send
Successfully
in a particular, tries to send. Okay? Any node can try to send in a particular time slot with a probability P. Any node. Okay? So in general, we have n nodes, and the probability that any node can send in a particular time slot is P. Okay? So now, what we need to do is that we need to find P that maximizes the capacity of the channel, or in other words, minimizes the collision. Okay?
The frame means the data.
The frame is the actual data that the node tries to send. Okay. So the slotted Aloha, the in terms of advantages, single active node can continuously transmit at full rate of the channel. That's what we said, that if the load is low, a node can actually consume the entire channel very easily without any overhead, with no overhead, right? Because even for the case of carrier sensing, you keep sensing the channel every now and then. Okay, so this is an overhead. Okay, so even though nobody else is trying to send on at the same time, but you have to keep sensing all the time. Okay, we do this because again at high load we try to avoid the collision. Okay, but at low load this is not required. But we don't actually know whether the network is highly loaded or very lightly loaded. We don't know. We use consistently. We use carrier sensing all the time. And that's an overhead. In the case of Aloha, we don't do that. Okay? All right, so it's highly decentralized, with the only exception of if we want to synchronize all the nodes in the slotted Aloha case, then one of the possibilities is just to use a centralized clock. But this is only for synchronization. It's not used for controlling the channel or the access to the channel. It's very simple. Does not require any overhead. On the downside, if there is any collision, that wastes time, of course, because we didn't do anything to avoid that collision. So when the collision happens, we have to do retransmission, and we have to wait until the end of the time slot to realize that the collision has happened. Again, we cannot detect it. The only way for us to detect that there was a collision is by not receiving the acknowledgement. So when we don't receive the acknowledgement, then we realize that there was a transmission error, whether there was a collision or anything, we don't know. Then we try to retransmit. So of course, if the network load is high, collision will happen very frequently, in which case you keep retransmitting all the time, and this will waste many time slots.
Doctor, we will retransmit from the point where the collision happened?
No. Even if you transmit even if there is a collision in 1 bit, you have to retransmit the entire frame. That's it.
How come that sender knows that it has been collided?
Huh?
How come the sender knows that it has to retransmit?
Again, just by not receiving the acknowledgement. This is the only way, because if the transmitter is sending the frame and the receiver is not sending any acknowledgement, this means that the transmission was not successful, so it retransmits the same frame. That's what we said in the previous slide. If there is no collision, we transmit the next frame. If there is a collision, we transmit the same frame. Okay? So there are some idle slots. So depending on when you want to send, of course, there may be some time slots where, well, I came in the middle of the time slot, so I have to wait. Maybe this way it will allow me to collide with another node in the next slot, and at the same time, in this slot there is no one sending. But I have to wait. That's how it works. So there may be some time slots that are idle or not used. Although in the case of asynchronous, this does not really happen, because if you want to send in the middle of a time slot, just send. There's no time slot. It's not slotted. So whenever I want to send, I will send right away. But here I have to wait for another time slot, even if this time slot there is no one sending. How would I know? I don't do carrier sensing. I don't do anything. But I'm restricted to have to wait for the next time slot. So I have to wait, even if that slot is wasted. Okay? So nodes may be able to detect collision, but they don't. There's no way for the nodes to detect collision.
Until it's happened.
Yeah, although it happened, but there's no way for the nodes to detect collision. And maybe if the nodes can detect the collision, they will abstain from transmission. And that's what actually happens in wired. If the node detects that there is a collision, they stop transmitting, and they conduct the back off technique. You know, they do back off, and then they generate random numbers, and they wait for a certain time, and then they sense again. Okay, but here we don't actually detect the collision. Therefore, Even if the collision happens in the middle of the transmission, we have to keep transmitting until the end, because we don't know, right? So this is a waste. Again, it's an overhead, but how would I know? I don't have any way of detecting the collision. This is, in fact, this is also valid for the case of Wi-Fi. So this validates in all carrier sensing techniques, or even no carrier, even in all collision-based techniques, this is valid because we don't actually detect the collision. Okay, so when we start to transmit, we have to keep transmitting until the end. There's no way for us to get in the middle and say, oh, there was a collision, okay, so I'll stop. How would I do this? I have to detect the collision, but I don't. Okay? And of course, finally, the clock synchronization thing, where we need to synchronize the time slots for the case of slotted Aloha. Okay, so any question?
How does there is acknowledgement? How is the technique that acknowledgement is received by the sender? Like
the acknowledgement is received by the sender. It's actually it's sent from the receiver to the sender.
Yeah, by what means? Through which channel? To the same channel?
Well, it could be through the same channel, in which case I have to divide the time slot itself into part of it is frame transmission and another part is acknowledgement. Or it could be on another frequency, or it could use anything. But this is the only way for me to realize that there was a transmission error. And even then, I don't even know if this is because of the collision or because of anything else. But for me, everything is the same. I have to retransmit anyway. Okay. So any enough, or we get to the analysis. We can talk about it next time. Well, let's stop here.